Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the 14th class of an introduction to the sciences of Hadith. And in today's class, we will be discussing the classification of Khabr Ahad, or the classification of Hadith, if you want to take it in a general sense, in respect to strength and weakness. So Sahih and Da'if. And this is probably the most commonly known or the most famously known classification of Hadith. So far, we've done classification based off of the amount of chains of narration there are. And we said that if there's a large number of chains of narration, or chains going back to the Prophet ﷺ, asanid, or the sanads that go back from the matan, from the actual text of the hadith to the Prophet ﷺ, if there's a lot of them, then that hadith is mutawatir. If there's a limited amount, and depending on which scholar is classifying it, then it can fall under khabr ahad, or a type of hadith that is known as ahad or khabr wahid as well. Then we broke down khabr wahid even further. And we said there are different methods of breaking down khabr wahid or khabr ahad. And one of the methods is also based off of the amount of chains, the amount of sanads that go to the Prophet ﷺ. And that's what we spoke about in our last session. So we mentioned three categories or three types. The first of the three was a hadith known as mashhur. And we said linguistically, mashhur means something that is well known or something that is famous. The technical meaning of mashhur is a hadith that has at minimum three different chains, at minimum three different narrators on that chain. And we said this is in respect to the earliest part of the hadith. So on the companion level, we're looking at least three companions narrating this hadith. Then below the companions, we're looking at least three again, narrating from the tabi'een, and then below that the tabi'een at least three again. If it falls below that, that hadith is not mashhur. So a mashhur hadith has three sanads going back to the Prophet ﷺ, three chains going back to the Prophet ﷺ, all the until whatever mutawatir is classified as. So we said the bare minimum that's mutawatir is the lowest bar, basically. The lowest classification of mutawatir is 4 independent sanads. Right? If you're basing it off of that definition, then mashhur is 3 to 4. If you're basing it off of the definition that mutawatir has to be 10 narrations. If mutawatir has to be 10 narrations, then mashhur is going to be anything below 10 until 3. So if a hadith has 7 different companions narrating it, 7 different tabi'in, right? So you have 7 people on each level, and your understanding of mutawatir is that it has to be 10 people, then that hadith is mashhur. So as long as it falls 1 below mutawatir, whatever your mutawatir bar is, then that hadith becomes mashhur all the way down to 3. That's our first category that we did. The second category that we did was hadith al-aziz. And al-aziz is a hadith that has at least 2 narrators on each level. So you're looking at 2 independent chains. So if it has 3, it becomes mashhur, it goes a level above. If it has less than that, it goes a level below. But if it has 2 independent asanid, then that hadith is known as al-aziz. And aziz chain is 2 chains on every single level. So if it has 2 on the first, the second level it has only 1 narrator, then the third has 2, that hadith is not aziz. It has to be 2 on every level. The third and final category that we did last time was a hadith known as gharib. And hadith gharib is a hadith that only has 1 chain. And then we did 2 different types of gharib hadith. One that starts off with multiple companion narrating it versus one that only starts originally with 1 companion narrating it. But anyway, if there's only 1 chain or there's 1 person on any level, automatically that hadith is gharib. That hadith is the lowest of that chain. Now these classifications, mashhur, aziz, gharib, they do not by default determine whether a hadith is sahih or da'if. Rather, they are a classification just telling you and informing you of how many chains this hadith comes to us. So you have the matan here. The Prophet ﷺ said this. How many chains go back to the Prophet ﷺ? That's all this categorization is telling us. It's not telling us that we analyzed every person in the chain. It's not telling us that we looked into the dabt, right? The precision of every narrator in that chain. It's not telling us any of that. That is today's classification. Today we will be discussing the classification based off of strength and weakness, something that is accepted and something that is not, in terms of, is it missing something? Is it not missing something? Today we will also be taking the very famous definition of a Sahih Hadith. What makes a Hadith Sahih? What are the 5 famous conditions of a Sahih Hadith? We will do that today as well. So that ends for us the recap of what we did last time. Today we'll begin with that. Before I do start, I want to begin by sharing a chart to give us a roadmap of what we will be doing. So let me know when you see this chart on your screen. Somebody just type in the chat box if you see a chart. Okay, perfect. So this is what we will be looking at today. A khabr ahad hadith, or actually put it this way, when you classify a hadith based off of its strength or its weakness, there's 2 broad categories. There's maqbool, which means accepted, and there's mardud, which means rejected. There's 2 broad categories, maqbool and mardud. The categories that we are familiar with is sahih and da'if, and some of us might know a category known as hadith hasan, right? And sahih and da'if are the 2 famous categorizations of hadith. However, sahih and da'if are under these categories. So you have a general or a broad category known as maqbool, which means accepted. It can be sahih, it can be slightly below sahih as well. And then you have a category which means it's not accepted. It's da'if. Generally, that's the only one that falls under it. And then there's different types of da'if. So we will be looking at these 2 broad categories. In the maqbool side of things, you have 4 categories that we will look at. You have as-sahih li dhatihi, as-sahih li ghayrihi, and then you have the same thing with hasan. So you have al-hasan li dhatihi and al-hasan li ghayrihi. Those are the 4 categorizations of accepted hadith, of hadith that we can use, hadith that are accepted. Mardud, in the rejected category, you have hadith that are da'if, and we will discuss what can possibly make a hadith da'if as well. And we also have a dedicated class for da'if hadith. So that is just to give us a picture of how we will do this. You can screenshot this. This is a chart that's in your books. I didn't make this chart. This is from the books. And I will also share this with you guys in the group chat. So let's begin with the first broad category, which is maqbool, accepted hadith. We will be looking at 4 different types of accepted hadith. The easiest way, the takeaway from this is in the maqbool side of things, you have a hadith that is sahih and a hadith that is hasan. And then there's something else that can strengthen a hadith to bring it to one of those levels. And that's why there's 4 categories. All right, let's start with as-sahih, the sahih hadith, or the authentic narration, right? This is the category that many of you are familiar with in terms of its name, that a hadith is sahih, a hadith is strong, or a hadith is authentic. That's all correct. Sahih means correct. And all of those definitions are perfectly fine, right? You can use sound, you can use correct, you can use authentic, all of those fit perfectly fine in the definition of Sahih Hadith. However, in terms of Sahih Hadith, we will be looking at 5 conditions. What makes a Hadith Sahih? There are 5 things, 5 conditions that a Hadith has to meet to be able to be called Sahih. Now, it's important that we memorize these 5 conditions because every other category, whether it be Hasan, whether it be Da'if, they are all based off of, their definition is based off of this category. So you remember when we did a hadith that's mutawatir, and we said that a mutawatir hadith has to have this many people on in terms of its chain, right? It has to have 10 people or whatever the conditions we did were. Then the other definitions of mashhur, of hadith that's ahad, they're all based off of the definition of mutawatir. So the definition of khabra ahad, for example, is a hadith that doesn't meet the amount required for mutawatir. In a similar way, the definitions that are for hasan, that are for da'if hadith, are based off of sahih. So if it does not meet a condition of sahih, depending on the condition that it does not meet, it can be hasan. Depending on the condition it lacks, it can be da'if. So the conditions, the 5 conditions that we're doing for sahih, it's important that we try our best to memorize them. All right. So a general definition, let's write this down for the general definition, and then we'll break down this definition. This definition that we're taking contains the 5 conditions within it, and we'll see how. A sahih hadith is defined as a narration with a continuous chain of narrators to the Prophet ﷺ, consisting of upright and accurate narrators that is not, right, that is, or actually put it this way, that's free from anything abnormal or defects. So these 2 things, it doesn't have any thing that's abnormal to it, and it's free from all defects. That is the definition of a sahih hadith in English. The Arabic version, which is a very famous definition of sahih hadith, is ما اتصل سنده بنقل العدل الضابط عن مثله إلى منتهى من غير شذوذ ولا علة. This is the definition that we translated it into in English. Okay, so what are these 5 conditions? Condition number 1, right? And again, the definition that you wrote down, it has these 5 conditions contained within it. It's also very similar, except for one of the words that changed it to abnormal, than the definition that's given to you in your book in terms of the translated definition. The first condition is that the chain ittisal as-sanad, the chain of narration is continued. There are no gaps. There's nobody missing in the chain of narration. Every single narrator must have narrated the hadith directly from the person that they're quoting. And there's no gaps inside that chain. So Arqam narrates from Muhammad, that narrates from Ahmad, that narrates from this person, that narrates from the companion, that narrates from the Prophet ﷺ. That's a complete sanad. There's no gaps. However, if my chain says Arqam narrates from this person who narrates from a tabi'i, who's a successor, who narrates from the Prophet ﷺ, we have a gap in that sanad. Who's missing? The companion. So it's lacking this condition of sahih. Right? So the first condition of sahih is that the sanad cannot have any gaps anywhere within the sanad, going all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. That's condition number 1. Condition number 2 is al-adala. This word should be familiar because we did this word before. When we discussed al-jarh wa ta'dil, when we discussed how to critique a sanad, right? How to validate or critique a sanad, we discussed the concept of al-adala, right? So the uprightness of a narrator. That's condition number 2, that all the narrators in the chain have to have al-adala. They have to be upright. They have to not be openly, committing major sins and whatever else categorizes in adala. If you remember, we did some of the major aspects of adala, such as lying, right? They have to be free from lying, free from accusations, or a lot of accusations of lying or whatnot. So the adala has to be complete for every single narrator in that chain. That's condition number 2. So far, so good, right? So we have a continuous chain. Number 2, for it being sahih, has to be adala. Number 3 is another concept that we did before as well, known as ad-dabt, precision, accuracy. Right, the precision, the accuracy, the way that the narrator preserved that hadith has to be complete. Right, there has to be full dabt, and every single narrator has to have full dabt in the chain. So now, not only are you looking at the dabt of any specific narrator, but to make it sahih, the condition has to be present at every level of that chain, going back to the Prophet ﷺ. Generally speaking, when you're talking about adala, the condition before this it usually ends at the tabi'in, because usually the companions are it's almost agreed upon that they have adala, that they wouldn't lie about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at least the Sunni perspective of it. Now you're looking at the next one, which is adabt, which is the one we were doing, which is accuracy. And in terms of the accuracy, as you'll see, this condition can change a hadith from sahih to hasan. But for now, we need accuracy. We need a perfect level of accuracy at every level. Let's put it that way. That's condition number 3. Condition number 4 is adam al-shudud. There's nothing that is abnormal. There's nothing unusual, right? There's nothing that's unusual, nothing that's strange, nothing that's abnormal. Usually this refers to it being or it contradicting a widespread narration, or it contradicting something greater. So there can't be anything that contradicts something that's there already. And this is slightly different from adding a condition or whatnot. So depending on the scholar, I'll give you an example of this. Just because a hadith has a condition or it confines something doesn't by default mean it contradicts, right? So in the Hanafi madhab, in the Hanafi school of fiqh, they would see that as a contradiction. That if the hadith does not align directly with whatever the mutawatir, whether it be Quran or a mutawatir hadith is saying, adding a condition, deleting whatever it may be, that can be something that contradicts. According to the Shafi'is, that's not. So just because something adds a condition or something like that, it doesn't by default mean it contradicts. Now that's left to the scholars of fiqh to decide whether in that school, in that legal methodology, that is considered something that contradicts or not. But here, for our purposes, for the science of hadith, it can't be abnormal or unusual or something that's out of pocket. It doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't fit in line with the general theme of the religion, the general theme of the hadith or whatnot. And to give you an example, if you find a hadith that says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam permitted oppression, right, something like that, it's unusual, it's abnormal, it contradicts the vast majority of hadith that are out there, the Quran or whatnot. So there's an issue with this hadith is shadh. There's an issue with this fourth condition that we're analyzing here. All right, the fifth and final condition of a sahih hadith is adam al-illah, right? Illah is a hidden, or not a hidden, it's a defect. And it can be two types. It can be an apparent defect and it can be a hidden defect. So illah means defect. Adam al-illah means that it's free from defects. And there's two types of defects. There's something that can be apparent, right? There's an apparent defect in the chain, or there's a hidden defect. An example of an apparent defect would be, let's say I narrate from, I heard George Washington say that the King of England said, or whatever it may be, right? There's a defect, there's an apparent defect. I can't hear George Washington. I'm, living in 2000, whatever, and born in 91, and George Washington lived in, the 1700s. So there's an apparent defect. It's not hidden. Anybody that knows a bit of history knows the biography or whatnot. And this is where, remember, we did the concept of the biographies of the narrators of hadith. That's where this is used when you're searching if a hadith is sahih or not. So there's an apparent defect here. Hidden defects are a little more, or obviously more subtle, right? It's something that a scholar of hadith would be able to recognize, something that we, that an average person won't realize. And not only that, the level of illah will depend on the scholar of hadith as well. And that's why, for example, if somebody like Imam al-Bukhari says this hadith is da'if, and somebody else says, well, actually I checked it as well, it's sahih, right? Imam Bukhari might be seeing an illah or something that he might, say, well, it doesn't meet the conditions that I set. So it can be that he's seen a hidden defect, that's why he says this hadith doesn't meet the 5 conditions of sahih. Whereas somebody else might see no apparent defects, no hidden defects in terms of what they see, and they classify it as sahih because it meets the 5 conditions. So depending on the one that's grading the hadith, there can be a difference as well. And also depending on the one grading the hadith, the conditions they set within. So Imam al-Bukhari might say, A, B, C, D, all of these are classified as defects. Somebody else might say, well, no, they're not. Actually, that's a really harsh condition. Only A and B are classified as defects. So based off of that, you'll have different outcomes as well. All right, so those are the 5 conditions. Let's recap the 5 conditions. Number 1, the chain must be continuous. Number 2, all the narrators must have full adala, which is uprightness, righteousness, good character. Number 3, all the narrators must have ad-dabt, which is accuracy, precision. Number 4, there can't be anything unusual or abnormal about the hadith itself. Number 5, it has to be free from defects, whether it be apparent defects or hidden defects. If a hadith meets all 5 of these conditions, it is a sahih hadith. It is considered a hadith that is sahih. Okay? Any questions before we do an example? I'm going to share the screen and let me know if you have any questions while I'm doing this. All right, can you all see this hadith that I shared on the screen? I have a couple of screen shares open today, so sometimes it doesn't do it for some reason. Okay, so it seems like you can see this hadith. So we have this hadith. Let's read the English. Abdullah ibn Yusuf narrated to us that, who said that Malik informed us, meaning Malik ibn Anas, Imam Malik, rahimahullah, from Ibn Shihab. You guys remember Ibn Shihab, right? It's talking about Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, from Muhammad ibn Jubair ibn Mut'im, from his father, who said that I heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam recite Surah Al-Tur in Maghrib. This hadith is narrated in Bukhari. So without looking that it's narrated in Bukhari, let's analyze this hadith. Number 1, the chain is continuous, right? Each one of these narrators is a student of the person they're narrating from. And we know this through the biography, right? The biography of the narrators. And that's why, remember we said if a person is majhul, if a person is unknown in the chain, the hadith is da'if because we don't know, we can't confirm that it meets the conditions. Remember, it's not that if it goes against the conditions, it has to meet the conditions to be sahih. So if we can't verify that each person or the chain is continuous or that they met each other, if we can't verify that, the hadith is not sahih. It doesn't meet these conditions that we need it to meet in order for us to say that it's sahih, in order for us to give it that grade. All right, so the chain is continuous. That's number 1. Number 2 and 3, all the narrators are upright and accurate. Remember conditions 2 and 3. Condition number 2 was al-adala, right? Upright, righteous. They have good character. All of the narrators that we mentioned here in this chain, they all check that box. Number 3, right here, if you look at number 3, which was ad-dabt, precision. All of the narrators are known to be accurate. Right? They're known to be accurate. Now, sometimes precision can go for a specific hadith, that in this hadith, the person wasn't accurate or whatnot, but here we're doing it as a general sense. So number 3 checks off for all of them. And it gives you examples here. Abdullah ibn Yusuf, trustworthy and accurate. Thiqa and muttaqin. Malik ibn Anas, right? The famous scholar of hadith. Imam Hafiz. So this word here, Hafiz, when you're speaking in a hadith context, and actually the original context of the word actually meant somebody who's memorized a large collection of hadith. Nowadays it means somebody who's memorized the entire Quran. However, originally the word hafiz meant somebody who's memorized a large amount of hadith, sometimes 100,000 hadith or whatnot. It wasn't usually used for somebody who's memorized Quran. So when it says somebody is a hafiz in the old sense, it meant that they're a master of hadith. They've memorized hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands of hadith. Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, this is the person we spoke about before as well in the history of preservation. Muhammad ibn Jubair, accurate, he's thiqa. Thiqa means somebody trustworthy, somebody who you can rely on. Jubayr ibn Mut'im, a companion. So again, when it's a companion, especially a well-known companion, right, there might be some difference of opinion on somebody who's only met the Prophet ﷺ once, on one occasion, right? So they came, they accepted Islam, then they went back to wherever they lived, and they never met the Prophet ﷺ after that, and they narrate from the Prophet ﷺ. That might be up for some scrutiny, right? But when you're looking at the companions and again, there's also a difference of opinion in terms of what exactly is considered companion when it comes to hadith, who the scholars of hadith classify as a companion or whatnot. But generally speaking, when you have the companion, it's considered trustworthy, thiqa. It's considered in terms of their adala is not questioned. In the vast majority of Muslim theology, the adala, the righteousness, or in terms of to even think that a companion would lie about the Prophet ﷺ or the words of the Prophet ﷺ. Now their dabt can be questioned. Their accuracy can be questioned, because that's not saying the person has bad character. That's just saying the person might have a weaker memory, or might not remember a certain incident correctly, and that's perfectly fine to question. However, to think that they would lie about the words of the Prophet ﷺ, that's usually not an issue according to the vast majority of Muslim theology, and mainly based off of the Sunni theology of hadith. All right, number 4, the text of this hadith does not contradict another authentic report. So there's nothing abnormal, there's nothing shadh, there's nothing unusual about this hadith. And number 5, there are no hidden or apparent defects. The word for that, and remember, try to memorize these new words. The word for that is the illah. There's no illah. There's no hidden defect there. Okay. So that is an example of a sahih hadith, a hadith that meets all of the conditions that we need for it to be sahih. Now, something to note, on kind of like a side note almost, is that, well, 2 things before we move on, actually. So number 1 is that some scholars have tried to identify what they considered asah al-asanid, the most authentic of chains, right? The stronger opinion, or the correct opinion, is that there's no specific chain that is considered the strongest. There's no agreed upon chain that's considered the strongest. Different scholars have their own preference that they consider, what chain they consider to be the strongest. For example, Imam Ahmad considers the most reliable chain to be the sanad from Imam az-Zuhri, from Salim, from his father, from Abdullah ibn Umar. Imam al-Bukhari, for example, says the strongest chain is the chain of Imam Malik, from Nafi', from Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, right? That's considered the golden chain for Imam al-Bukhari. And Imam al-Bukhari, for example, if he were to find a chain that's different from that, he would rather include the chain with Imam Malik, because his respect for Imam Malik, right? So Imam Malik had a very high position when it came to hadith, when it came to fiqh. So even if a chain was slightly longer, Imam al-Bukhari would prefer to include the chain of Imam Malik rather than a shorter chain, due to the value that it holds by having Imam Malik present in that chain. So different scholars are of different opinions in terms of what is the strongest hadith chain, the strongest hadith chain. But the reality is that there's no agreed upon chain that is considered the strongest hadith chain. So that's side note number 1. Side note number 2 is that not every sahih hadith is equal in its strength. So not every sahih hadith, or let's say not all sahih hadith are created equally, right? Not all sahih hadith are equal. So just because 2 hadith are both classified as sahih does not mean that they're equal, okay? And you'll see that in many examples of, you'll have 2 sahih hadith that might contradict in terms of the conditions that it implies on a certain ruling or whatnot. And a scholar of fiqh might take one hadith over another, and that could be for various other reasons. So sometimes scholars of hadith would take a hadith that's narrated by a companion who's a faqih, who's also a scholar of fiqh, versus a companion who's not, when the hadiths kind of contradict. And their reasoning is that the companion who's narrating the hadith, who's a scholar of fiqh, also understands fiqh, and then we can rely more on that person than somebody else who doesn't understand the fiqh as well, when both hadith are sahih. So not all sahih hadith are equal. And as we discussed in the example before as well, that depending on the grader, depending on who is actually grading that hadith, right, you'll have a different outcome. So if Shaykh Albani rahimahullah, who's a scholar of the late era of recent actually, if he grades a hadith and he says it's sahih, right, versus Imam al-Bukhari who says it's sahih, it's not going to hold the same value, right? It's not going to hold the same value. Imam al-Bukhari is probably one of the single most recognized top scholars of hadith with the most stringent conditions, right? Within these conditions, right? He's a lot tougher on these conditions. Whereas, Shaykh Albani might not be as tough as Imam al-Bukhari, rahimahullah. So depending on who's grading the hadith, the outcomes will be different as well. So not all sahih hadith are equal in their value, again, for various reasons. Now you do have certain hadith that become stronger. So for example, there's a term that we did before, which is muttafiqun alayh, which means it's in both Bukhari and Muslim. So if a hadith is in both Bukhari and Muslim, that's considered pretty strong, that both Bukhari and Muslim, they checked off on the value of that hadith, that it met all the conditions, right? Then you have hadith that's only in Bukhari or only in Muslim or whatnot. Again, this is just for example purposes. So if you see a hadith that's just in Muslim versus the hadith that's in Bukhari and Muslim, the one in Bukhari and Muslim obviously had to pass through two different tests, Imam al-Bukhari's test and Imam Muslim's test, versus a hadith that only passed Imam Muslim's test. So it's that all sahih hadith, right, can be used, but not necessarily are used, and not necessarily are equal in terms of their strength and in terms of their value. All right, so that covers sahih for us. Sahih, that is done. 5 conditions that it needs to meet. Let's move on to al-Hasan. I hope that wasn't a lot. I try to do not too much in each of these sessions so we can memorize these. I know these couple of classes are going to get a little more technical. There's a lot more words that are coming out that are new that we need to memorize. So try to review the words at least once after class as well, so it gets familiar in your vocabulary, inshallah. All right, so let's move on to hadith that is al-Hasan. Linguistically, Hasan means something that is good, something that is nice, something that is beautiful. That's the definition of Hasan in terms of the linguistic meaning. The technical definition of Hasan is a narration that meets the conditions of Sahih, so the 5 conditions, except that there's some weakness in the accuracy of either one or few of the narrators. So it is the same exact 5 conditions, except you can loosen the condition of dabt, the precision condition. I think that was condition number 3 in the way that we did it. Let me just confirm. Yes, condition number 3 in the way that we took it. So a Hasan narration is the same condition that we just went through in Sahih, except for the condition of dabt, you can slightly loosen that condition. So maybe one person in the chain is not known to be that precise. Maybe a few people in that chain are not known to be that precise, right? So this is the Hasan. Not the Adala, the dabt. So you're not loosening the Adala. If the Adala is attacked on the narrator, if the narrator is known for lying, that hadith is not Hasan, that hadith is da'if, it's weak. If the dabt is being questioned, which is the precision, the hadith is Hasan. It's not Sahih, it doesn't meet the highest category, but it's Hasan. It moves slightly below because you loosen the condition of its precision or accuracy in terms of the preservation. Okay. What I want to do is let's do this. So basically you have the same 5 conditions. You've weakened one of the conditions, which is the dabt of the hadith. However, the other four conditions are still met. So the chain is continuous, right? The adala is still there for each and every single narrator. This is important for each and every single narrator. There's nothing that's abnormal about the hadith. There's nothing that's unusual about the hadith. And then there's no illa, there's no defects on the hadith. Now, a hadith that is considered hasan, that's classified as hasan, is still a binding legal proof. It can be used in fiqh. It's just like a sahih hadith in that sense, except it's not as strong. So if it contradicts the sahih hadith, obviously, the sahih hadith will take precedent generally. Now, a hasan hadith is under maqbool. Remember, it's under accepted. We accept a hasan hadith. And again, it can be used for legal proofs, and it can be accepted in terms of doing good deeds. And you'll see how some da'if hadith can be accepted as well. We're going to talk about this. The way I want us to think of hasan is like this. A lot of times people have this mindset that you have sahih all the way on top. Think of sahih as 100%. Then you have, realistically, sahih is like 95 to 100 because they're all sahih are not 100, right? Some sahih could be 99 depending on the grader. But let's just say sahih is all the way up top. Then all the way at the bottom you have da'if, and again, not all da'if are equal as well, right? They're not. It's not a monolithic category that everything in this is sahih, everything in this is da'if, and they're all equal in value. Right? All da'if can be different. Some da'if can be used, some da'if can't be used. Some da'if are not even supposed to be narrated. That's how weak they are. So you have sahih all the way on top. You have hasan all the way at bottom. Da'if all the way at bottom. Hasan hadith is not in the middle. And I know the book said something like in between da'if and sahih. Hasan hadith is not in the middle. Hasan hadith is realistically more towards 75%. So more towards like 75%. It's closer to sahih than it is to da'if, put it that way. So it's not dead center. It's closer to sahih hadith than it is to da'if hadith. So you have the scale. You have sahih on top and you have da'if at the bottom, right? It's not going to be right in the middle. It's actually going to be a little closer to the sahih side. And depending on how many people's how many people's precision in the chain is being questioned, it'll be closer or further from sahih. All right, now that's two categories so far. And these are the two most famous categories of accepted hadith. The next two categories that we will do, right, of accepted. Actually, we're going to do accepted, we're going to jump to da'if, and then we're going to do the last category of accepted. The next category is known as sahih li ghayrihi. And the easiest way, I don't want us to concentrate too much on this. This is a hadith that is a hasan hadith. So sahih li ghayrihi literally means that sahih for some other reason, for some extrinsic reason, for some outward reason, right? So it's sahih for some other reason, not in itself. So remember the chart that we put up, and I'll put it up now again so we can see it and visualize it. Give me a second. All right, let me know when it's shared. You see the chart, maqbool and mardud chart, the one that we had in the very beginning. Everybody can just drop a yes if you can see the chart. Okay, perfect. So it seems like you can see it. So if you look at this chart, right, under maqbool, under the side that's accepted, you have as-sahih li dhatihi. As-sahih li dhatihi, the easiest way to think of it is just a sahih hadith. Li dhatihi means for itself, in itself, meaning it meets the 5 conditions by itself. It doesn't need anything, outside help. Think of it that way. So li dhatihi means in itself, it is sahih. It meets those 5 conditions that we talked about by itself. It does not need any supporting evidence. It does not need any support from the outside. As-sahih li ghayrihi, this is the category that we're doing, is a hadith that's elevated to sahih. So this in reality is a hasan hadith, and it has outside help that raises it to sahih. So you remember we said, imagine sahih being on top and then hasan being a little higher than midway, right? Sahih li ghayrihi elevates this hasan hadith there's outside help elevating this Hasan hadith to the level of Sahih. So the hadith in itself is not meeting the 5 conditions. However, there are other hadith that speak on the exact same thing that, might all be Hasan or whatever it may be, but because there's so many of them, they raise the level of what this hadith is telling us. So if this hadith is telling us, for example, and I'm completely making this up, that Dhuhr is 4 rakats, right? I'm talking about in terms of a Hasan hadith saying that there's Dhuhr 4 rakats. If that's what the hadith is telling us, and the hadith is Hasan, that's the grade of the hadith because of the issue with the dabt, with the precision of the narration or the narrators. And I have all of these other hadith, these outside hadith, helping or saying the same thing. I saw the Prophet ﷺ praying 4 Dhuhr. The Prophet ﷺ said there's 4 Dhuhr. And all of these other proofs, they raise this Hasan hadith to the level of Sahih. And it's known as Sahih li ghayrihi, Sahih for other reasons, for outside support. Because of outside support, it gets raised to that level. Did everybody understand that? I hope that was clear enough, right? So you have hadith that is Hasan in itself. It only meets the conditions of Hasan, but because of outside help, it raises to Sahih. However, the first category, which was Sahih or Sahih li dhatihi, you don't need to say li dhatihi, you could just say Sahih. Sahih, it meets the conditions within itself. It doesn't need any other supporting hadith. Even if there's no other narration saying the same thing, this hadith remains Sahih by itself. Whereas this Hasan hadith is only raised to Sahih li ghayrihi, right? Sahih for other reasons if there's supporting evidence. That's all this category is. That it's a Hasan hadith raised to the level of Sahih because of all of the other hadiths that are there. And the purpose of this, for example, if I tell you there's a hadith that's Hasan, right? Versus if I tell you there's a hadith Sahih li ghayrihi, right? It gives a little more value. So you have this hadith which is Hasan, and then I give you a hadith that's Sahih li ghayrihi. It's slightly above. So you have Sahih hadith all the way on top. Below Sahih hadith, you have Sahih li ghayrihi, Sahih for other reasons. Below that, you have Hasan. So Sahih li ghayrihi is in between Hasan and Sahih. Sahih li ghayrihi, Sahih for other reasons, is in between Hasan and Sahih. Okay. And again, remember, this is based off of other chains of narration. So to highlight and to kind of connect last class with this class, imagine you have a hadith which is Aziz. What is a Aziz hadith? Anybody want to write it in the chat? A hadith that is known as a Aziz hadith. Very good. So 2 narrators, right? So because it has 2 chains, right? So now you have a hadith. This is the matan. You have a matan that's a hadith. You have 2 chains going to the Prophet. The first chain, we grade it. We put it to the test. It doesn't meet the test of Sahih. So we check the it's continuous, check, right? Adala is there, check. It's not abnormal. Nothing unusual, check. There's no illah that I can see, right? Check. There's some issues with the dabt. So now it's not sahih, it doesn't meet the 5 conditions, it moves to Hasan. So this chain is Hasan. However, you have another chain taking that hadith to the Prophet ﷺ. That chain is also Hasan. Because you have 2 Hasan chains going back to the Prophet ﷺ, that hadith slightly rises to Sahih li ghayri. You see how it works? That classification of Aziz tells us that there's 2 chains to this hadith. Each chain is going to be graded individually. You don't grade it all together. So a hadith that's mashhur, you don't grade all the chains based off of the weakest chain. Each chain is individually graded. And because they're all the chains of this hadith or all the chains of mashhur hadith or whatever it may be, or Hasan, it rises to Sahih li ghayri. Now let's say, for example, this Aziz hadith that we're looking at, the first chain we graded was Hasan. The second chain that we looked at was missing the companion. What is this chain? The second chain we're looking at is missing a companion. What is this chain? of this Aziz hadith? Anybody can write it in the chat. It's missing something in the chain. Da'if. Very good. So the second chain is da'if. What is the overall ruling of this hadith? If I gave you this matan, what's the ruling of this hadith? Would you say this hadith is da'if or this hadith is hasan? Because we have two chains. One chain going is a hasan chain, one chain is da'if. What's the ruling of the hadith? And this is to kind of test the application of it. So you have an independent chain that's hasan and an independent chain that's da'if. Okay, I'm getting some answers. Okay, so it's actually not da'if, right? If you use the chain that's da'if, it's da'if. If you use the chain that's hasan, it's hasan. So this hadith is actually hasan. It will go, the chain that's there is independent chains. Now, however, because one chain is da'if, you can say if you want that actually I'm not categorizing this hadith as aziz because I don't recognize the second chain. So I'm categorizing this hadith as gharib, which means a hadith with one chain only and the chain is hasan, right? But even if you categorize it as aziz and it has one chain that's weak and one chain that's hasan, through the chain that's hasan, that's an independent chain. That's an independent chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ. Therefore, that chain is hasan. That hadith is a hadith that's hasan. If all of them are da'if, right, you have nothing to elevate it higher than da'if. So it remains da'if. Okay, now let's move to the next category, which is da'if. So from the chart that we had on one side maqbool, which is accepted. We had sahih li dhatihi, sahih by itself. We did that already, which is just sahih hadith has to meet the 5 conditions. We had hasan, right? Hasan is 4 conditions. The 5th one is loosened a little bit. It still has the 5th condition, it's just loosened, right? You have sahih li ghayrihi, sahih for other reasons, which is a hasan hadith that's raised to the level of sahih. And then you have hasan li ghayrihi, which we'll do after da'if, right? So hasan li ghayrihi, that still needs to be talked about. Let's move to the other side of that chart, which is mardud, rejected. And that is da'if. That's the category of weak hadith. The word da'if in Arabic means weak. It means weak. The technical definition of da'if is a hadith that does not meet the conditions of sahih or hasan. So a hadith that does not meet the conditions of sahih, which are 5, or hasan, which are 4 plus the 5th one, just a little loose. It doesn't meet those conditions, right? It's da'if. So a hadith can be, and write this definition down, that if a hadith does not meet the conditions of sahih or hasan, it's considered da'if. That's the definition. That's why it's important for us to memorize the conditions of sahih hadith, the definition of a sahih hadith. Now, the thing that can make this hadith da'if can be multiple factors. So for example, from the conditions of sahih, the first condition is that the chain is continuous, right? If the chain is not continuous, it lacks a condition of sahih. Therefore, it is da'if. The issue that's making this hadith da'if is a lack in the chain. The issue can also be an issue with the narrator himself, right? One of the conditions of sahih is that there has to be adala, no lying. If one of the narrators are known to be a liar, that's an issue with the narrator itself. So generally speaking, a hadith can be da'if, and this is a broad category. There's 2 main reasons. Number 1, there's a problem in the chain of the hadith. Right? There's somebody missing in the chain. There's an issue with the chain of the hadith. Number 2, there's a problem with the narrator in the chain, meaning his adala is questioned usually. So those are the 2 main reasons why a hadith is da'if. And then there's, for those that read the reading for today, there's a list, right? It gives you all of these new words that it tells you a hadith can be da'if and classified as this or that. But that's not for today. We're actually going to spend an entire class on the different categorizations. However, what I want us to know is that depending on what makes that hadith da'if, there's a specific word, there's a specific classification. Just as I can tell you a hadith is Qudsi, and automatically you know that goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Or I can tell you a hadith is marfu' and you know it goes to the Prophet ﷺ. Or I can tell you a hadith is mawquf and you know it stops at the companion, right? It goes to the companion. Or I can tell you a hadith is maqtu' by one word, right? A precise word, you know exactly what that is referring to. In the same way, the category of da'if is a very broad category. It has more than 10 different categories. And depending on the defect, depending on what's wrong, if there's somebody missing in the chain, if there's a companion missing in the chain, if there's a tabi'i missing in the chain, there's a precise word for it. So as soon as I say the word, you'll know. Similar to if I say a hadith is aziz, and you know it's 2 chains. It has 2 independent chains. If I tell you a hadith is mashhur, you know it has minimum 3 chains. If I tell you a hadith is gharib, you know it only has 1 chain, right? Just like those words make sense to you now, in a similar manner, da'if hadith have different categories on what's making it da'if. Is something missing in the chain? It's called this. Is something missing on top of the chain? It's called this. If there's a hidden defect in the chain, it's called this. If there's an apparent defect in the chain, it's called this. So depending on what's causing the issue, there's a certain name for that category. And that's what we will discuss in our next class. Now, the last category for today, from that chart that we did, there's only one category that's missing. And that is al-hasan li ghayrihi. Li ghayrihi for other reasons. So we had sahih li dhati, sahih by itself. We had sahih li ghayrihi, which is really a hasan hadith raised to the level of sahih because of outside help. We have hasan by itself. It meets the 5 conditions, except for one of the conditions a little loose. And then we have hasan li ghayrihi. Hasan li ghayrihi is a da'if hadith by itself. So it in itself is a da'if hadith. Just like sahih li ghayrihi. Sahih li ghayrihi was a hasan hadith by itself. Because of outside help, it moved to sahih li ghayrihi. Hasan li ghayrihi by itself is a da'if hadith, meaning it doesn't meet the conditions of sahih or hasan by itself. But because of outside help, it gets raised to the level of hasan at least. It doesn't get raised to sahih, but it gets raised to the level of hasan. Now, there's a lot of conditions to raise it to this type of level. One of the most important things to note is that the weakness cannot be based off of the adala. Remember, adala is pretty much one of the most important categories, especially in terms of lying. That the weakness cannot be based off of lying, right? It has to be other things. So maybe there's somebody missing in the chain. So maybe the hadith is that everything is good to go except for condition 1. What was condition 1? That the chain is continuous. What's the issue here? We have the tabi'een saying, meaning the successor, saying that the Prophet ﷺ said. Now there's a clear issue here. The chain is not connected, right? The tabi'een is saying the Prophet ﷺ said. There's no way the tabi'een met the Prophet ﷺ, so there's a companion that's missing that's not mentioned in the hadith. What is this hadith categorized as by itself? You guys can go ahead and write it in the chat. By itself, what is this hadith? Maqtu' in terms of its chain, very good. But the tabi'i it's not a narration of the tabi'i. It's a narration that the tabi'i is saying the Prophet ﷺ said. So maqtu' would stop at the tabi'i. That is correct. But generally, maqtu' when we speak about it, it's talking about an action or something about the tabi'i. The tabi'i said this. Now, if the tabi'i is trying to connect the chain to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ said such and such. It's missing somebody from the chain. This hadith is a hadith that is da'if. It's a da'if narration because it's missing somebody from the chain. Automatically, whenever you miss somebody from the chain, it's da'if. Remember, right? Think of it this way. If you're missing a sahaba, a tabi'i, anybody in the chain, it doesn't even have to be sahaba, tabi'i, right? Let's say I narrate from George Washington. I skipped over a couple of generations, but let's say I narrate from somebody from the 1910s, or whatever it may be, or 1910s could be possible. Let's say I narrate from somebody from 1850, something like that. There's a gap. There's somebody missing between me and that person, right? So this is at the rare end of the chain, towards the bottom of the chain, missing somebody. That hadith, does it meet the conditions of Sahih, the 5 conditions? No, it's not meeting the first one. Does it meet the conditions of Hasan? No, it doesn't meet the first conditions. The conditions of Hasan is the same as Sahih, except for one of the conditions is lucid. So it doesn't meet the conditions of Sahih, it doesn't meet the conditions of Hasan. What did we say is the definition of da'if hadith? A hadith that does not meet the conditions of Sahih or Hasan. Because it doesn't meet the conditions of Sahih or Hasan, this hadith is da'if. So automatically, no matter how tricky it may sound, that the tabi'in that's narrating is extremely pious, like Hasan al-Basri says the Prophet ﷺ said, that narration is weak, right? That narration is weak. Now, it can be raised to the level of Hasan li ghayrihi. So let's say the chain is completely sahih, going all the way up to Hasan al-Basri, right? It's completely sahih, everything checks out, except for once it gets to Hasan al-Basri, who is known as a righteous person, his hadith is taken, his fiqh is good, right? He's a righteous individual, Hasan al-Basri. He says the Prophet ﷺ said, so the chain, everything checks out, it looks like a perfect chain. However, there's a companion missing, right? Because there's a companion missing, it doesn't meet the conditions of Sahih, it doesn't meet the conditions of Hadith, that Hadith is da'if. It moves to da'if. Now, let's say there are other narrations from outside, not in itself, that are strengthening this Hadith of Hasan al-Basri, right? It can get raised to the level of Hasan li ghayrihi, Hasan for other reasons. So it moves to the level of a Hasan hadith, but not because it's Hasan in itself, but because it's Hasan for other extrinsic reasons. So that is the general overview of how to grade a hadith based off of the strength and the weakness of the hadith. Whether that hadith is accepted, it can be sahih by itself, meaning lidatihi, sahih for other reasons, lighayrihi. It can be hasan lidatihi by itself, or hasan lighayrihi for other reasons, right? Or it can be mardud, rejected, right? And that's da'if hadith. Now, if a da'if hadith does not have outside help, raising it to the level of hasan, it remains in that category of da'if. It doesn't become hasan lighayrihi. Okay, that ends for us today's class. I updated this chart for you guys, so let me actually show you. And then if you want, I can, actually I did put it in a hierarchy form as well. Just share this. Okay, hopefully you can see it. Let me know when you can see it. Once it's shared on the YouTube live stream, putting it up there so they can screenshot it as well. So this is updated, right? So this is a chart that I sent out before, and I said, as I said before, as we continue, the chart will be slightly updated as well. So here we can see, and let me stop the YouTube video, just 1 second.